I wanted a place for people to receive authentic guidance and practical ways to awaken. Thought-provoking, paradigm-shifting, and empowering. This is about expanding our human consciousness to create a wave of new possibilities. I'm Dr. Theresa Bullard-Whyke, and this is Quantum Minds TV. Welcome to Quantum Minds TV, where we take a deep dive into various perspectives on what it's going to take to create a shift in human consciousness. Now, today, I'm very honored to have Gregg Braden joining me. Gregg is a 5-time New York Times bestselling author, scientist, and a pioneer in the emerging paradigm-bridging science, social policy, and human potential. A simulation and the idea that is very much a modern day concept, but it could also, as you're saying, it gives us a new language or maybe a new metaphor to use to compare. Whereas in past traditions, they use the metaphor of the dream or, the metaphor of something else. And in the movie The Matrix, I think they picked up on this idea of the simulation. And, you have your kind of programmed reality that is the illusion, and yet it's really happening. And then you have this, getting out of that simulation or out of that matrix, and you've got the real world, and where you have real autonomy and real ability to choose for yourself. And so it's disconnecting from that programmed sort of consensual reality story and shifting into a more sovereign story, a story where that you have the ability to create your life, that you have the ability to shift your own software and to change the expression of your DNA and so forth. So maybe we can kind of come back a little bit to how do we do that within within epigenetics, for example, but also, you've mentioned the power of words and mantras and vibrational energy to influence the DNA. There's so many keys that we have where the power's in our hands to, adjust what's going on inside of us that then allows us to create a better way of life, a better reality for ourselves.
Yeah. Well, I think, and I threw in the simulation because what it has done, it has included an entire genre of engineers and scientists that felt excluded for so many years in these conversations that weren't necessarily on board with the spiritual language or the metaphysical language. And I've had them in my audience, and they say, wow, I never thought of it. And now they're on board with it, but it doesn't make any difference. Whether you're talking about spirituality or indigenous traditions, or you're talking about the simulation, all of them invite us to discover the best version of ourselves. And the best version of ourselves is the full extent of our humanness, the extraordinary potential that lives within us as our humanness. We all learn differently. And that's the beauty. We all learn differently. And so different language will open the door for different people at different times. But we're all working toward this best version of ourselves. And what you're doing is, and I so appreciate the platform here to be able to share this, because it is very different from what we've been conditioned and led to believe when we begin to see the potentials within us. So for me, we could do a whole program on this. I think one of the most fundamental potentials is the understanding that we have a neural network in our heart that is separate and independent from the neural network in our brain, but we are unique in the fact that we can harmonize those two networks at will, on demand, when we choose. This is a mind blower. 2 separate organs with 2 separate neural networks that we can harmonize into a single potent system. And that system, when we do that, it opens the door to deep levels of our potential, to an enhanced immune response on demand, to awakening longevity enzymes on demand. And it's not just about longevity. If you are living a long time, it means you're healing along the way. So deep states of healing. it opens the door to deep levels of resilience to change in a healthy way. And our world is changing so fast. Who doesn't want that resilience? To deep states of cognition, super learning, super memory, super recall, and so much more, simply by utilizing this extraordinary, this soft technology in a way that we typically don't think about using it. So for some people, it's a very different way of thinking. And for some people, it's say, right on, man. You know, I've always had a feeling that we could do this. And this state of awareness that's called coherence is very familiar to us when we're young. And as babies and as young children, until we're conditioned out of it through our environment, through our culture and family, well intentioned, but as we become enculturated to function in the world, we typically will leave this natural state of coherence. And that's why it feels so familiar when we return to it.
Well, if I may, so, let's get into some practical things here, because, the brain, if we're trying to find a place of coherence within our brain, there's multiple tools that we can use. There's meditation is one, music is another one, singing and chanting is another one. All of these things will really create that harmonic state of our brain. Even like playing chess, we're doing strategy games, that harmonize left and right hemispheres, Tai Chi, Qigong, these kinds of movements, all of these will help, create that harmonic brain state. And then, you mentioned bringing it into the heart, and the heart state as heart math, and you've been talking about, is very much that place of compassion, gratitude, empathy, joy, the exuberance and imagination of a child, just really coming at it from that open-hearted state. And then there is a third, nervous system in our body, which is in the gut. And we have so many neurons within the gut, and the gut is responsible for producing like large majority of the serotonin that then is sent to the brain to affect our mood and to affect our sense of balance. Our biochemistry gets balanced there. And here is, you mentioned breath before, and breathing, and that deep belly breathing helps to bring that harmonic state into the gut. And what I find fascinating is that these three centers, the third eye, the heart, the gut, the second chakra, these were in like the ancient martial arts systems were considered the three chi centers, or the three, they call them dantians or tandens, where there's wisdom, there's life energy. And so harnessing these technologies within our bodies through all of these practices that are part of the ancient traditions. And yet now we're seeing the modern science coming in to collaborate with and to corroborate that, these are important tools that we can use to awaken.
Absolutely. And I love everything you're saying. And I think it's important. I've found this with our live audiences to let people know we are always in some state of coherence. The key is, and we're always in some state of healing. The key is to optimize that coherence, to optimize the healing. So there is a science to this, and we know that the optimum signal from the heart to the brain to establish optimum coherence is a very low frequency. It's 0.1 hertz. And it's no accident that it is this frequency, because when you look at the magnetic field resonance line, this is where I get to be a geologist. I love this. When you look at the magnetic field resonance of the planet under our feet, so this is not the Schumann resonance in the cavity between the surface and the ionosphere. That's something separate. This is a fundamental. It's called the field line resonance of the planet. When you look at that map, the first spike that you see is it's not zero and it's not 0.2. It is exactly that 0.1 hertz. So when we harmonize our heart and our brain to 0.1 hertz, we're actually harmonizing our biological body with the fundamental magnetic of the planet we live on. If we go to another planet, we might have to do another frequency. 0.1 hertz. This is where our healing begins. Now, the beauty is that coherence is not limited to the heart and the brain, once it's established between the heart and the brain, because it is coherence and it's optimum, it is influencing every system in our body, including the neural network in the gut. So the gut is very much a part of this, and it is harmonized as well. So this is interesting. 1991 is when the scientific community found the neurons in the human heart. It was published in 94 in the journal Neurocardiology, 1994. I think it's Harvard University. Once the scientists found those neurons in the heart, they said, where else might they be? And what they found is that there are sensory neurites pretty much in every organ of the body. Mm-hmm. Now, the difference is they are not developed. The neural network in the other organs is not developed to the degree that it is in the heart. So the heart and the brain, when we harmonize those, bring them into coherence through 3 steps: focus, breath, and feeling. When we harmonize those, that coherence radiates, it extends, and brings the entire system into this state of coherence. And we are also bringing our bodies into coherence with this fundamental frequency of the planet. By the way, whales communicate with 0.1 hertz. It's so universal. And military submarines, which is why it's the problem for the whales. But it's because it is such a universal frequency. So how do we do that? 3 steps. We focus our awareness. We move from our brain into our heart. And you can touch your heart gently a little bit to do that. Slow the breathing a little bit slower than usual, but breathe longer on the exhale than on the inhale, which is what stimulates the parasympathetic nerve, the relaxation, the parasympathetic nervous system. But number 3 is where we really establish this coherence, and it's with an emotion. And when we can feel on demand the emotion of gratitude or appreciation, care, or compassion, and those are the 4 words that work most successfully for most people in the English language. There are others you can experiment and see what works for you, but almost every time gratitude will do it, appreciation, care, and compassion. When we do those 3 steps, so we harmonize these neurons in the heart and the brain, that is the answer, I think, to the question. You're talking about practicality, because we open the door to an enhanced immune response, to the longevity enzymes, super learning, super cognition, resilience, all those things. And that's passive. Just by doing those 3 steps, those are passive benefits. Now we have active benefits where we can take advantage of that coherence and go into altered states, deep states of awareness, access the subconscious for affirmations and things like that. So it's a gateway, and it begins in the heart. So many indigenous traditions, I know I'm talking quickly because I feel like we're going to run out of time, but so many of the indigenous traditions, from the shamans in the Yucatan and the Andes of Peru, and when I was in Tibet, and certainly the Aboriginals, and when I'm with the Bedouin in Egypt, they all begin these processes in the heart and with breath. Mm-hmm. So it's that, I think, is one of the keys to practically applying this inner technology, and the alchemy is part of this, because we are changed in the presence of our coherence. We are changed biologically, and we change the way we feel emotionally.
Well, it's so interesting too, because in the fetus, the very first organ that starts to operate is the heart, and then it starts to create a harmonic with the mother's heart. And then the ear and the brain start to be programmed by that early heartbeat within the fetus. And, so you have the heartbeat of the mother, the breath of the mother, the heartbeat of the baby. And then these are programming and sending the signals up to the brain for it to be developed. And, so these are the early rhythms. And then for it to also have this 0.1 hertz resonance with the fundamental frequency of the Earth's magnetic energy. And that is, like tuning into that heartbeat of Mother Gaia as well. Mm-hmm. And isn't it that this 0.1 hertz also is a resonant energy that runs through the vagus nerve? Does the vagus nerve kind of is that main nerve that connects the brain and the heart and the gut and all the organs? And
It's like the superhighway. It begins right at the base of the skull and goes down into the base of the spine, and it has so many access points. When you look at the vagus nerve, it has access points out to the eyes, and so there are eye movements that can stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system. It has access points to the mouth, and that's why when you smile, you're actually triggering that relaxation response into the lungs. That's why the breath is important. Into the genital area, and that's why many of the ancient tantric practices also tie into this. So it's like the superhighway of the information. And that's why it's been so important in, so many traditions. Yeah.
Well, what I love is that these ancient traditions, without knowing the science about it, they, through experience, learned the tools and the methods that, again, the power was in their own hands to harness these, things within us. And they didn't know the ins and outs of what was going on in the body, but they did know from an experiential level the impact that it was having upon us. And they saw not only was it having on them as an individual at a subjective level, but they saw that as they taught those same methods, meditations, chants, and, working with different musical instruments, and so forth, the breath work, all of these things, they passed them on through the generations and saw that, these tools work for everybody when they use them. And so that's, again, speaking to that inner technology that is the best technology that we can learn to harness.
Well, it is, Theresa. So now I'm going to come back the other direction. We live, because this isn't happening in a vacuum, we live in a society where we're being conditioned that we are flawed as a species, and that we need something outside of us to be healthy in our bodies and to be successful in life.
It's a great way to drive consumerism.
Well, it is.
Yeah.
And technology is being touted as the savior and the replacement of biology with technology. So I'll make a distinction. There are different levels of this. If we use contact lenses, that's an external technology that helps us in the world, and I think that's fine. We begin replacing skin and organs and tissues and neurons with artificial intelligence on computer chips embedded into the tissue. That's a whole different story. And what the science is, I'm just researched the articles on this. I didn't know we were going to talk about it. I don't have them here. But the science is very, very clear that we have the biological adage is use it or lose it. So if we don't use our systems, and if we don't use the neurons in the cells, our body assumes that they're not needed and they stop producing them. So we now know, for example, that we produce new neurons in the brain up until the last breath of life. We used to think it was a fixed number, and we know it's not. But we also know that when a new neuron is produced, it must be engaged in a meaningful way within 2 weeks of production, or it will atrophy and die because it's not being used. So now think about it. We got three-year-old kids. They wake up in the morning, they eat their Captain Crunch, Crispies or whatever it is for breakfast. They go sit in the living room and they put on a VR visor, a virtual reality visor, and for hours, they are watching colors, intense colors that they would never see in the backyard. And they are seeing sounds and sights. But here's the key. It's all being done for them. So they are observers rather than using their imagination and their creativity that we did when we were kids to make forts in the backyard and to make alternative realities to experience. And now the studies are showing, first, the visual cortex is thickening in the young people, which impacts their cognitive abilities, and not necessarily in a good way, but their developmental abilities, their socialization with other kids, naturally, is waning because they're not doing it. But their cognitive abilities, their cognitive development is being impacted because they are not being stimulated to do these things on their own. This is the first generation where this has happened. And so I think we have to be aware of this so that we can allow technology to serve us rather than become enslaved by the technology in a way that many people, like Ray Kurzweil, says by the year 2050, we will have synthetic bodies. And if we are operating in synthetic bodies, then we've lost the DNA antenna that tunes us to our divinity. And I don't think Ray Kurzweil is thinking in that way, or maybe he is. And there's a whole conversation.
Ray Kurzweil just wants to live forever in a machine, by transferring his brain into the machine. So,
well, this is the transhuman.
He doesn't believe in the eternity of the consciousness beyond the body. Even when people, you mentioned the use it or lose it, even when people, I think everyone can, who has had glasses can relate that, at the very beginning, you might need the glasses because your eyes are starting to fail. But then as you get used to the glasses, it's like it actually, the eyes, it becomes harder and harder to focus on its own. And it relies more and more on the glasses. And then we have to get, greater and greater prescriptions. And, with the brain, those neurons that are wired, if we stop using those neural pathways, they will be pruned, right? And they will be cleaned up because they're not being used anymore. And with the kids, even before the virtual reality stuff, just the personal devices and those saturated colors make the brain think it's candy. And the people who, are behind so much of the software and the development of these technologies, the parents know, they know they don't want their children growing up being addicted to these technologies. And so they're putting their kids in schools where the technologies are not being used, and they're putting limits upon how much they allow their kids to get on them. Not that we can't use technology, but I think in the developmental stages of a child and the wiring of the brain, which is all the way from, the fetus all the way up until at least 25 years old. And then with that plasticity, we're still constantly able to rewire our brain. And yet, there's a certain point where we can have a fully developed human engaging with these and having enough self-control and will and discipline to disengage with the technology and live a real human life as well. So yeah, it's a frightening point that we're at. But there's also equally, I feel, the possibilities within technology to harness it and create a much better world as long as it comes in.
I agree, Theresa. What it's doing is it's pushing us for the first time, to understand who we are. And it can be a frightening time. It's also a very exciting time, because now we're understanding the human body and human consciousness in ways that we never have before. Cloning is a perfect example. And I think many of your viewers and in our community are familiar a little bit with cloning. The first clones was the sheep. Dolly was the one that was, made national news. What a lot of people don't know is the clones look like they are successful at first. So the clone of Dolly looked and acted like Dolly for a while, or now they do it with bovine cows as well. And there's a mystery that has surrounded the cloning process, and this is forcing scientists to understand better who we are. And the mystery is this: the clones appear to work and function perfectly at first. Something happens and they begin to break down, and they typically live about 50% of the lifespan of the original sheep or the original cow. And the scientists they don't understand. They say, well, look, the DNA is exactly the same. How can it be? This is what the piece they're missing. In the DNA, in the cell, there's DNA in the nucleus, and there's DNA outside of the nucleus, the mitochondrial DNA. And they are tuned together, and they are also tuned into the field. All right? When the clone is created, they take one of those cells and they pull out the DNA in the nucleus. They take that out, the original DNA, and they put it in the DNA from another being in there. It's no longer tuned to the mitochondrial DNA. It's no longer communicating with the field that is holding it in place. And it loses that communication, that breakdown. That's forcing the scientists to grasp a non-physical process that is influencing the DNA that they have never wanted to access in the past. And the same thing would be true for us. If we're replacing our DNA with synthetic bodies, synthetic organs, synthetic skin, and it's just a brain in a synthetic body, we're no longer tuned to that part in the field. This is where our divinity comes from, our ability to transcend the limits, the perceived limits of what it means to be human. And we're at the critical crossroads. I mean, it's this generation, it's happening within this generation. These decisions are being made. Yeah. So I think we owe it to ourselves to know what it means to be human, perhaps for the first time, and to embrace the deep truth of our humanness. And then from that empowered perspective, make the choice, what role does technology play in our lives? How much of ourselves do we give away to the technology?
So good. So I love what you said there about the DNA and the mitochondria being tuned into the quantum field and in a way entangled with each other, and they inform. And it just, again, comes back to that, the evidence that's showing how the DNA is very much connected to the quantum field. It's like this bridge between us and the quantum realm. And, I love what you said about us, really getting to know who we are as human. You've dedicated so much of your life and your career to helping move forward this awakening of human consciousness and this shift, in the collective, by bridging the science and the indigenous wisdom and yet very practical things. Not only do we want to awaken at an individual level, but we want to also awaken at a collective level. So what do you feel really needs to happen for us to access that critical mass point of people waking up and choosing to steer the course, with this tipping point that we're at, to steer the course towards the reality of what we can create as humans versus the dystopia?
I think, well, we're bringing it full circle, coming back to where we began. I think the old idea of critical mass, I think it takes on a different significance with the new ideas of us living in a quantum reality, to where it is less about the sheer numbers of people that embrace the ideas and more about the quality of the ideas that a relatively few number of people can embrace on the quantum level. And it's a very different way of thinking for some people. But I think this is where we are right now. Everyone learns differently, and we are so diverse in our experience, and we are so blessed, Theresa, to have the time to devote to just having this conversation today, when many of our brothers and sisters are just trying to live through the end of this day. By us living in our lives what we are claiming in this conversation, we are uplifting our brothers and sisters everywhere. We have to anchor these possibilities into the field to make them more accessible to others who may not be thinking the way that we are right now. I mean, anybody can do this, but by us bringing these ideas, crystallizing them and focusing upon them and embracing them and living them in our bodies, and we finish in just a few minutes, we're going to finish and we're going to go walk out into our world. How do we live in the world, what we're talking about here? And every time we do that, we're making it more accessible to our brothers and sisters in our global family who may not have the same perspective. They don't have the luxury of spending a couple of hours having this conversation, and living by example. I think is a lot of that. A lot of it comes down to something that people don't like to hear. It's personal responsibility. But as we take responsibility for our own lives, rather than asking a higher authority, a government, to take care of us, for example, as we embrace the sovereignty of what it means to be human and live that in our lives, personally, I think others benefit from us doing that collectively. And I think this is the way that this new world emerges. I mean, realistically, I'm an engineer, and I'm an optimist, and I'm also a realist. Realistically, we're in it, we're in a change. And the only way out of it is to go through it.
Mm-hmm.
And realistically, I think what will happen is we are witnessing two parallel societies emerge. One is all in on all the technology and everything. They're just hook, line, and sinker. They're in. And another part of society, and these are my rural neighbors and my rural community at my little co-op where I do my grocery shopping. They're not plugged into that tech. They don't know everything that's going on, but what they do know, something is happening in the world that doesn't feel right. And the way they respond is they say, we need to slow down and go back to basics. We're going to teach our kids, take them out of public school and teach them the values that we want them to have. We're growing some of our own food. So when the supply chains break down, we're not as impacted. This is how they're responding. So two parallel societies, and we're going to do what humans always do. We're going to check each other out, and we're going to say, who's happier? Who has stronger relationships? And the answer to that question is what will bring our communities together. And I think this is where the unity comes from. The answer to that question is what people are going to say. They're going to say, I want what they're having. I want that happiness. I want that sense of well-being. I want that health and healing. And they'll begin to mimic the lifestyle that is informed by the consciousness that we're talking about right now. And I think realistically, this is what I see happening. Does that make sense if I say it that way?
Yeah, it's really interesting because it also almost gives a new context to what happened during a couple of years of the COVID-19 pandemic, where the world shut down. You couldn't go to work, the usual distractions of being out and about in the busyness, especially in the urban type of living. We had the unplug, life slowed down for a bit, and it gave, there was of course the tragedy of the deaths and everything that was happening, but amidst it, it also forced people to slow down and to regroup themselves and to reevaluate what is important. And, and then when we are forced to only be able to connect through Zoom, for example, and digital, and there's all this isolation, it reminded people of the value of actual human connection, real relationships, going out and spending time with the kids outdoors, doing something fun rather than just putting them on the video games. I mean, there was real human value and that was re-emerging, and a reevaluation of purpose, a sense of like, what do I really want to do? Because now people don't want to even go back to work or get back into the grind.
Well, one of the things I know we're seeing that one of the things that revealed was in the hierarchy of human needs, water is still number one. We need water and air, obviously. Food has now fallen down that hierarchy. You can go for a couple of weeks without food. But what they found is that community moved up in the hierarchy. Community was more important than food. And people that didn't have that connection, sadly, many of them took their own lives because they felt so isolated and so alone and so powerless. And so what we find is that community, we've always known it was important, but now we know why it's important, and that it's become more important than ever. And localization, as we go through a time of extremes where formally we are being urged into centralized living. So rural living is being discouraged. People are being urged to go into large population centers and to live in very densely packed large population centers. That's what's happening in media on the one hand, but on the other hand, what people are finding is that localized living is the way to move through these times of extremes. So what does that mean? It means localized agriculture, localized food, farm to table, which a lot of people do, localized economies, localized finances, localized sources of energy. And all of those, I think, contribute to the community that we're talking about. And that community is based on ultimately our humanness and what it takes to be fully human and to be happy and to be healthy and fulfilled.
Wonderful. So, Greg, I want to thank you so much for, joining me on Quantum Minds TV. There's so much more we could have talked about, and I would love to at some point hopefully have you back on. 'Cause there's, some deep conversation that we can continue to get into in multiple directions. But I just want to see if there's any final words that you would like to leave people with in terms of, what's most important right now for them to be able to make that shift.
Yeah, well, thank you for that opportunity. I am a huge fan of Buckminster Fuller. He was a man way ahead of his time, a visionary. I wish he were still with us today. I think he passed in the mid 1980s, but he said something, and I have worked with people who knew him and worked with him directly. And he said something that touched me so deeply. And I say it to myself pretty much every day. And what he said was, you'll never change the world by fighting against the things you don't like. So if you want a new world, find a new model that makes the old model obsolete. Yeah. And people will follow the new model and the old model falls away. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. Now, I totally get that there are sometimes the warrior in me has to fight sometimes. And we all know that. But ultimately, there is a new world that's trying to emerge. And I think if we can become the best versions of ourselves and live that in our families, in our communities, in our everyday lives, we've won the battle without ever having to fight, because we have claimed the deep truth of our humanness and the deep truth of our power. And I think ultimately that's all we can ask of ourselves at this time. So that's what I'd like to say in closing.
I love that. Thank you so much, Greg. That brings us to the end of this conscious conversation with Gregg Braden. And Greg, thank you so much for sharing your vast experience and insights with us. And I will look forward to at some point having you again on Quantum Minds TV.
Greg and Theresa, show number 2, and I look forward to that as well. Thank you for sharing me with your community and for trusting me and having this conversation. It's an important conversation, and you are such a master at what you do and at leading this conversation. I'm honored to be with you, Theresa, and I do it again in a heartbeat.
And now, stay tuned for a bonus video with Dr. Theresa Bullard as we take a deeper dive into critical mass and coherence.
One of the things when it comes to reaching critical mass that we've often heard about is, okay, it's the 100 monkey effect. So maybe it's like 10% of the population or 3% of the world population that we need to up level, to awaken to a higher level of consciousness in order for us to create that tipping point or that critical mass point within the collective that has awakened. And then that can snowball or ripple out into the rest of the collective to also awaken. But what you just said there about really it might not be a hard percentage of the population, for example, or an exact number of people, but really it's more about our connection in and our ability, the quality of our ability to access the quantum field as individuals. And maybe we can say it's more going to be a critical mass of the measure of how much coherent energy can we put into the collective field as individuals and then as groups. So if I, as an individual can reach a coherent state, and then if I can, really sustain that coherent state for longer periods of time and even live in a coherent state, now I'm contributing more energy and coherence into the field than if I'm only achieving coherence in little blips, for example. And then if I know how to not only reach a coherent state, sustain that coherent state, and live from that coherent state, if I know how to amplify that coherent state, which is something that we really learned how to do within the mystery tradition, and this is something I've learned within the mystery school and through the process of initiations and so forth. These are ancient spiritual technologies for how to amplify, how to accelerate our growth and our ability to have an impact on the collective. And then we learn the tools for how to create that coherent state. Now we can reduce the number of people who are needed. And yet we can really work on the quality of the people who are really putting in the effort to achieve those coherent states and then put that into the collective field. And if we can then create a resonant effect amongst those individuals who are doing it from a quality level, like there's a whole new realm of possibility of, what it's going to take to create a shift in human consciousness, because maybe we don't have to reach 10% or 3%. Maybe we can become, as individuals, we can become that shift. We can become that critical mass through our own impact into the collective field. And yet, having said that, we're not lone rangers here. We're not here to, no man is an island. We're not here to do it on our own as an individual. We're here to do it as a collective. So we are here to co-create this experience, which is why it's so important that we come together in communities of coherent people who are ready to work together to create a resonant and an amplified effect that then can impact into the quantum field. So that's giving me a lot more hope that we can indeed achieve this shift in collective consciousness when we learn how to really access a quantum conscious state.
This conscious conversation was created, produced, and recorded by Dr. Theresa Bullard-Whyke in collaboration with Gregg Braden and edited by Verse Content and HH Films and Photo. The theme music was created by Tim Mountain of Even Load Productions. Quantum Minds TV is a product of the Quantum Learning Academy.